You have written one of the books is Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, The Rise and Fall of Byzantium, 955 AD to the First Crusade. So this period we talked about survival and some low points. This is a period where, once again, there's some flourishing. So by the 10th century, in the Macedonian era, the empire is back. It's wealthy, it's culturally confident, and under emperors like Basil II, who I think is in your top 10 list, it is expanding again, and this is the period you describe in part in your book, Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood. So how did Byzantium go from surviving to expanding again?
So I wrote that book in part in order to test myself and see if I could write narrative. So I hadn't written a history narrative book up until that point. Everything I wrote was sort of analytical, right? And it was successful enough that a few years later, my editor asked me to write the big history, the New Roman Empire, the 1,000
of the whole thing.
Of the whole thing. And so I set for myself the task of explaining in this book, Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, a very particular period that was marked by a sudden turn to conquest again after a long period of more or less defensive war. 955, there's a new military leadership is appointed, and the Romans go conquering again, especially in Cilicia, northern Syria, and Cyprus and the Caucasus, and then eventually also Bulgaria. And then right afterwards, they have this generation-plus period of stability and prosperity, and then they're hit by a triple whammy. These are three new attackers. So it's primarily the Seljuk Turks coming in from the east, some Pechenegs coming down from the north over the Danube, and the Normans in southern Italy. And under the pressure of this three-part attack, this expansionist and what had become more imperial state buckles and enters another one of these crises, just like the one we described for the 7th century, survives it by the skin of its teeth and goes on again to rebuild and become prosperous, wealthy, and powerful again, as it does throughout its history. It's these cycles. So I just wanted to describe that iteration of that process, and that's what I do in that book.
So I think the traditional view in this perfect storm of the 11th century is that it was more to do with the internal sort of moral decay and civilian emperors neglecting the army, this internal stuff. And you make the case that it's the external stuff, the three-prong attack. Like you said, Normans in the west, the Turkic steppe people in the north, and in Central Asia, the Turks in the east.
Yeah.
Can you describe that, the three forces, in the case that was the main reason why it hit a low?
Well, this is also a methodological problem, right? In other words, when you're looking at a society that suddenly faces a bunch of problems, and you could, reasonably make the case for a kind of decline or a crisis, it's your first instinct to suppose that there must be something wrong in the internal mechanisms of that society that, led it to fail, which is what my field has done traditionally, in part because of the decline and fall model, right, of this society. We're kind of primed to think that there was something wrong with it. That's a long story. Or is it reasonable to say that a society that does not seem to have any, particularly serious structural flaws is hit by external, challenges that it couldn't realistically have foreseen or prepared for, such that, it couldn't cope with them and, as I said, buckled. And I think that's what happened. I think that's the main narrative. Not that there weren't problems, there were. But no state medieval or ancient, can realistically survive the simultaneous attack of three very different kinds of enemies. The Normans are like these knights, like a new type of Western warfare that is just all about, grinding the enemy to bits. but who are also terrorists. Like, they're straight up terrorists.
Normans are fascinating because, I mean, there's a Viking component too with the Normans.
Yeah.
That's a whole...
Yeah.
So they have three different kinds of enemies.
Yes. The Pechenegs was, a totally different type of, probably mostly nomadic horsemen. And then the Seljuk Turks, who are also mostly nomadic horsemen, but who are coming in from Central Asia with vast reserves of manpower behind them. In fact, either intending to, or as it happens, affecting a demographic change in not just demographic, but ecological too, because they basically, when they move into Asia Minor, they're transforming or terraforming agricultural land into pasturage.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just backed by reserves of manpower that no other enemy of the empire has had yet.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, how do you cope with these situations? I mean, it's very, very difficult, and it's a wonder that they survived it at all. Now, they also have internal problems. I'm not going to sort of try to sweep these under the rug, right? In particular, we're seeing the end of the Macedonian dynasty. This is a dynasty that had lasted for about 2 centuries. And this has a kind of politically destabilizing effect. New emperors, and there are a lot of like childless old men in this period, are relatively insecure. They don't have this kind of a dynastic glitz behind them. And so they're tending to buy a lot of political support, like hand out these exemptions, give cash, titles to anyone who will support them. And this, of course, causes a budget problem. Like, they don't have enough money after a while. And then they have to start raising all of these armies to deal with all of these problems, and that just increases the pressure on the budget. And so there is an internal problem as well, yeah.
So you mentioned this loop of thriving and then having to surviving, that happens a few times throughout the history of the Roman Empire. It seems that societies in general oscillate in that way. Is there something particular you could say about the oscillations, the loops that the Roman Empire goes through?
Yes. Now, I don't think this is an oscillation. At least that's not how I think of it in my own mind. So as I explained, the crises that this polity, this state, this society that it undergoes are there are a discrete number of them. I can tell you what they are, and we've talked about most of them so far. They don't last very long, and they are all sudden challenges that appear from the outside. In other words, they're exogenous shocks that they can't really have prepared for. These shocks cause massive territorial loss, which requires adjustment, right? But they don't last that long. In other words, the Romans almost always, at some point, figure out how to hold a line, how to consolidate their position, regroup, and put their economy and their society back on a trajectory of revival, regrowth, and eventual reconquest. Always, every single time, except the last time, right? And for me, this poses the following kind of dilemma, which I can answer. And the dilemma is, should we define the society by these brief crises of exogenous shocks, or should we define it by the centuries-long, sometimes, periods of regrowth, consolidation, and stabilization, which are endogenous? Nobody came from the outside to help them rebuild. And my answer is unequivocally the latter. So I see this as a society whose internal organization primes it to stabilize and embark on steady growth. Slow and gradual, but steady. And that's what I would like my field to explain more. And I'm going to try to do so in the book I mentioned that I'm writing on like the longevity or the resilience of this society, and not try to center the crises, which I see as being from the outside. Like, these aren't, of course, they're part of its story, but they're not coming from it. What's coming from it is the stability. And I think that's the more interesting part of this society.
Yeah, so these peak to peak histories, as you can think of them. They miss the machinery in the valleys, institutions, incentives, daily life, all of these things, the politics, the religion. You have a bunch of revisionist history ideas in your work. You're challenging the field.
Yes, you could say that.
In the best possible way. So just to linger on it, what are some of the things that historians miss? So this is a big one, right, that you're speaking to, which is like focusing too much on specific moments versus on the broad structural underpinnings of an empire, of a society.
Right. So what you alluded to there is a critique of what we might call short histories of Byzantium, which is a kind of genre of a book.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This isn't necessarily like what my other revisionist ideas are about. The more important ones are things like the monarchical republic that we talked about. In other words, that there's actually a broader spectrum of political participation, that emperors are having to look over their shoulders all the time, that there is a deeper matrix of Roman republican thought there. Like that's one revisionist idea. Another one is about Roman identity, just like who are these people?
Mm-hmm.
And no, they are Romans, and in fact, it's kind of an ethnic identity after a certain point. Like those kinds of ideas. The criticism of the peak-to-peak kinds of books. So if you're trying to condense 1,200 years into 120 pages, or even even 200 pages, there's no way to do so realistically and give a sense of the whole terrain. In other words, what these books do is they jump from highlight to highlight. And these highlights are sometimes things like, everything Justinian did because it's so extravagant, to the crises.
Mm-hmm.
The crises are, of course, dramatic moments that you can't skip. And you can't get a sense from these books as to how all of this is interconnected in the valleys, right? In the crags down there. Like what are the mechanisms that are connecting these peaks together? And that's how I tried to write the big history, the new Roman Empire, is to tell the story by casting light in those darker places. That is to show how, especially institutions and ideologies sort of tie, people's lives together. That is, tie people to institutions and to the broader history that surrounds them. So that the reader can get a sense when I'm recounting specific events, or either of greatness or of success or of failure, that they can understand roughly why these things are happening. Right? Look, there's no perfect answer. A short book will just not tell you these things. A long book, well, is a long book.
Well, in some sense, I mean, even in this very conversation, I think we did a pretty good job of looking at the values, at the structure, at the institutions, and that gives you a sense of the whole underpinnings. And so it's beautiful. It's a beautiful way to see history, especially for societies that have lasted as long as the East Roman Empire has.
But it did take us a few hours.
Yes.
You're right, but it requires that you actually spend some time to look in there. Yeah.
What's a few hours among friends?
No. That's I agree.